There's something quietly sacred about the way older people tell stories. They'll sit across from you, their hands folded, their eyes not quite on you, and begin to speak in that drifting way memory does, half here, half somewhere else. Sometimes the story is a little different than the one they told last year or last week. Sometimes they tell it again and again, each time with a new detail or a softened ending. And sometimes they say something that makes you pause and think, wait, that's not how I remember it at all. That's where this reflection begins. Because something happens in those moments, especially in families, when an elderly parent, grandparent, or loved one tells a version of a story that doesn't match the facts. Someone speaks up to correct them. No, that's not how it happened. You weren't there, remember? Or worse, you already told us this. And maybe the facts are important in certain contexts, but more often, I think we miss what's really happening. We get caught up in chronology, but we miss the psychology of it. We listen with our ears, but we forget to listen with our hearts. What if the purpose of these stories is not accuracy, but integration? What if the elderly aren't just reminiscing, they are repairing, piecing together the shape of their life, trying to make meaning out of decades of emotion, confusion, regret, and love? What if the repetition, the revision, the re-narrating isn't a mistake, but a final act of authorship? In this episode, I want to explore the emotional and psychological importance of storytelling as we age, why we need to let our elders tell their stories, even if the facts shift, even if we're tempted to jump in, even if we carry our own pain about the past. Because beneath the surface of the story is something deeper, something about dignity, coherence, and the need to be seen, not just for who we were, but for who we believe ourselves to be. Let them tell the story, even if it's not yours, even if it's not quite true. Because for them, in that moment, it's everything.
Hello and welcome to The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. RJ Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
We often think of memory as a record, something objective, archival, factual. But memory is not a filing cabinet. It's a narrative. It's a process. It's alive. And especially as we age, memory becomes less about what happened and more about what it meant. In developmental psychology, Erik Erikson described the final stage of life as a confrontation between ego integrity and despair. That final internal reckoning. Did my life matter? Do I understand who I was? Can I live with how it unfolded? Or does it all feel too scattered, too unresolved, too full of regret? What the elderly are doing when they tell their stories, especially in a loop or with slight revisions, is often not reminiscing in the way younger people imagine it. It's not for entertainment or even nostalgia, it's integration. They are trying to take the jagged, mismatched, unresolved memories of a life and sew them into something coherent, something whole, something they can live with. This drive toward emotional coherence, not factual precision, is what makes these stories so sacred. And that's why they change over time. Because part of aging is reframing, re-seeing a mistake in a gentler light, reclaiming a moment of strength that once felt like failure, or finally telling a story you weren't allowed to tell before, now that there's no one left to silence you. These narrative shifts are not lies, they're not manipulations, they're not even inaccuracies, at least not psychologically. They are acts of emotional repair. I've seen people reframe a divorce that devastated them. In their 30s, they told it like a trauma. In their 60s, they tell it like a necessary step toward becoming themselves. I've heard people talk about parents who once hurt them terribly, but later in life, they choose to remember a moment of tenderness instead. Not because they forgot the pain, but because they needed to re-anchor the story in something loving, something human. And yes, sometimes elderly people do misremember details. Sometimes it's memory loss, sometimes it's cognitive decline, but even that doesn't change the deeper truth that we are all wired to make a story out of our lives. We need it. It's how we make peace with imperfection. It's how we soften the rough edges of things we cannot change. So when someone in their 70s, 80s, or 90s begins to tell a story and you notice that it's a little different than the way you remember it, pause. Ask yourself, is this a factual correction I'm about to offer? Or is it an interruption to someone's process of becoming whole? That's what's really happening here. They're not just telling a story. They're trying to say, this was my life. This is how I want to understand it before I go. There's a moment so many of us have lived through and so few of us know what to do with. An elderly parent or grandparent begins telling a story at dinner. Maybe it's one they've told before. Maybe it's starting to shift in content or tone. And someone, usually with a gentle laugh or a need to clarify, says, hey, that's not what happened. Or, no, you weren't there, remember? Or, you're mixing that up with another time. And on the surface, it feels harmless. We're trying to help, to clarify, to keep the story accurate, to avoid confusion. But in reality, what often happens in those moments is far more emotionally complex and more damaging than we think. Because the second we interrupt someone's memory, especially in old age, we do more than correct a detail, we disrupt a process. We forget that the elderly person speaking is not just trying to entertain, they're reaching for something inside themselves. They are narrating not just facts, but feelings. They're not just remembering, they are reconciling. And what do we do when we step in? Well, we rob them of that opportunity. We replace the reflective space of storytelling with a cognitive quiz. We turn meaning making into a courtroom, into some sort of contractual comparison of factual evidence. Even worse, we sometimes make it about ourselves. Think about how often corrections happen because we feel uncomfortable, because we remember that differently, because we need to defend our own role, because we want the record to reflect the version of the past that still lives inside us. But here's what's important. The version that lives inside them is just as valid, maybe more so, because it's theirs, and it's the only one they get to carry to the end. There's also something deeply existential in play. When you tell someone they're wrong about their own life, especially late in life, you risk destabilizing their sense of identity, of memory, of self. You don't have to agree with their version. You don't have to like it. You don't have to adopt it as your own. But correcting it in that moment serves very little good. You might be right, but being right is not always kind, and being accurate is not always what's needed. There are, of course, moments when correction is necessary, especially when someone is causing harm or erasing real trauma. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the gentle, blurry, looping stories that are part of a natural psychological process, the kind that don't need fact checking so much as witnessing. I think of it this way. When someone is giving a eulogy, no one interrupts to say, actually, that's not how it went. We understand in that moment that what's being shared is not journalism, it's truth of another kind. So why would we deny that same grace to the living? We can be so focused on the past being properly cataloged that we miss the truth unfolding in front of us. They're not just getting old. They're finding a way to leave emotionally whole. And our need to correct them might be getting in the way. There comes a point in life when storytelling shifts from being about what happened to being about what remains. The elderly often return to certain memories, not because they've forgotten everything else, but because those stories have become anchor points, landmarks in a long emotional map. When someone repeats a story or suddenly reframes it, they're doing something more than reminiscing. They are curating their legacy. That's why it feels different, because it is different. It's not just memory, it's ritual. We don't always think of storytelling as ritual, but it is, especially near the end of life. It becomes a sacred act, a repetition with meaning, a way of saying, this is what I want you to remember about me. This is the moment I want to live on. That might be why some stories shift in tone over time. A moment that was once told with bitterness is suddenly told with warmth. A mistake becomes a lesson. An act of survival is now described with pride instead of shame. And that shift may not reflect cognitive confusion. It might reflect emotional evolution. Let me say that again. That shift in how the story changes may not reflect cognitive confusion. It might reflect the evolution of their emotional content. Sometimes people needed to be the hero in a story where they once felt like a failure. Sometimes they need to be forgiven. And since no one else ever did it, they forgive themselves by telling the story differently. That's what storytelling can do. It can heal. Think about how many people don't get a second chance in life. They don't get to go back and say what should have been said or do what should have been done. But storytelling lets us time travel emotionally. And as people near the end of life, that power becomes more important than ever. It may be the only way someone gets to speak to a person they've lost, or to their younger self, or to you. Not as you are now, but as the child you once were, when they didn't have the words or the emotional maturity to say what they can say now. And that's another layer. They're not always talking to you. Sometimes they're talking through you, to memory, to time, to a version of themselves that still needs peace. That's why listening matters so much, because if you interrupt them, if you shut down the story or call it inaccurate or rush them along, you're not just breaking a conversation, you're breaking the ritual. the final reckoning, a moment of emotional repair that may never come again. We're so often taught that legacy is something formal: wills, obituaries, life accomplishments, awards. But more often, legacy lives in the smallest stories, told quietly at a kitchen table. A moment when someone says, I always regretted, or that was one of the best days of my life. When they tell you those things, it's not just casual memory. It's transmission. It's them offering you a piece of themselves to carry forward, a thread in the fabric of your own becoming. And our role, the sacred role, is not to evaluate it, edit it, or correct it. Our role is to receive it. If there's one emotional skill we're rarely taught, it's how to listen without needing to correct, control, or redirect. And yet, it's one of the greatest forms of love we can offer, especially to someone in the later years of life. To bear witness means to stay present while someone shares a truth they may not be yours. It means holding the space without shaping it. It means valuing the connection more than the content. And that's harder than it sounds, right? Most of us are wired to jump in, to clarify, to help, or to protect our own version of events, especially if the story being told doesn't feel quite right, or if it paints us in a way we don't agree with. But emotional maturity, emotional intelligence asks something more of us. It asks us to distinguish between what's helpful and what's necessary. And in many of these moments, what's necessary is not clarification, it's presence. Let me offer a vignette. A father tells his adult daughter a story about how he supported her dream of becoming an artist. He describes himself as encouraging, open-minded, proud. The daughter remembers something very different: silence, discomfort, the way he used to change the subject whenever art school came up. She feels the urge rise within her. That's not true. She wants to defend her memory, her experience. And maybe she even has the right to. But what happens if, just this once, she doesn't? What happens if she lets him tell it the way he needs to? What if, in doing so, she's not agreeing with it, but allowing him to become who he wished he had been? Because sometimes the stories people tell in old age are aspirational. They're stories of reconciliation with the person they meant to be. And they may never say, "I'm sorry," but the story itself is the apology. The revision is the reconciliation. And when we can see that, we begin to witness differently. Let me share some emotionally intelligent practices to keep in mind when you're listening to an elderly person's story, especially one that drifts or reinterprets the past. Pause before correcting. Ask yourself if the correction is truly necessary or if it's about your own discomfort. Validate their version without abandoning your own. You can hold both. Resist the impulse to fact check or timeline the memory. Reflect what mattered emotionally in the story, not just what was said, but what mattered emotionally. And most importantly, stay with them. Don't rush them along or dismiss what's being shared. To bear witness well is to recognize that the story isn't just about what happened. It's about what it feels like to be the person telling it, what they still carry, what they're still trying to release. And what an honor, really, to be the person they choose to say it to. What an act of trust to be handed a final version of a story and asked silently, "Will you let me leave it here?" That's the sacred task. Not to rewrite it, not to debate it, but to receive it. When someone reaches the final chapters of life, they often start to speak in stories, not just for remembrance, but for reckoning, for repair, for peace. And those stories, however imperfect, however repetitive, however emotionally revised, are sacred stories. Letting someone tell the story of their life in their own words is one of the most dignified things we can do. It says, your life mattered. Your voice still matters. I will not take the pen from your hand in the final pages. And it's not easy, especially when our own memories clash with theirs, especially when the story being told contradicts a truth we've carried for years. But letting them speak doesn't mean we're erasing ourselves. It means we're honoring the larger arc of a life, one that may have stretched through pain, silence, change, and evolution, and recognizing that this version, this final version, is theirs to tell. There's a kind of emotional generosity required here, right? A willingness to be the listener instead of the editor, to be the keeper instead of the critic, to be the witness instead of the judge. Because in the end, storytelling is not just about remembering, it's about becoming. And the elderly are not just revisiting the past, they are shaping the story they want to leave behind. So if you're lucky enough to still have someone in your life who wants to tell you a story they've told before, let them. Listen like it's the first time. Respond like it might be the last. Because it will be, eventually. And when they're gone, you may find that what stays with you isn't the accuracy of the details. It's the sound of their voice, the rhythm of their memory, and the shape of the story they chose to leave in your hands. Let them tell it. Let it be a little messy. Let it be theirs. And hold it like the legacy it is.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.